Jimmy Fallon frozen when Tom Hanks suddenly breaks down. After hearing this old voice, Tom Hanks put his hand over his mouth. Not at the end of a story, not after a joke landed, mid-sentence. The audience of 300 people watched him go completely still, his eyes fixed on something no one else in the room could see. Jimmy Fallon stopped talking. The cameras kept rolling. Nobody told them to stop. It was a Tuesday night at 30 Rockefeller Plaza. The Tonight Show set was warm. The crowd was already laughing, already loose. Tom Hanks had been a guest dozens of times. The crew knew him. The audience loved him before he even sat down. Everything was right. Everything was flowing. The Tonight Show control room still talks about what happened that night. Then a producer walked on stage carrying a small cassette player. Not a polished prop from wardrobe, not something staged for the segment. Just a small, scratched gray Sony cassette player with a cracked hinge on the lid, the kind they don't make anymore. She set it on the desk between Jimmy and Tom. She pressed play. She walked away. The recording started. Not loud, not clear, just a voice. Old tape. A little distorted at the edges. The voice of a woman, maybe 60, reading something aloud in a quiet room. She wasn't singing. She wasn't performing. She was just talking. Slowly, like she had all the time in the world. Tom Hanks's hand went to his mouth. His shoulders came forward. His eyes went wet before the second sentence finished. Jimmy leaned forward without speaking, watching Tom the way you watch someone standing at the edge of something enormous. Tom, Jimmy said. Just that. 2 words he didn't finish. Tom Hanks shook his head once. The entire studio froze. 300 people held their breath. Someone in the third row thought he'd had a medical episode. A woman near the aisle stood up halfway before sitting back down. The band went quiet without being told to. Was it a collapse? Was he ill? He was 68 that year, and for 3 seconds the room didn't know what it was watching. His voice barely above a whisper, but caught perfectly by his microphone, Tom Hanks said one word. Eleanor. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened in 1988. Tom Hanks wasn't always Tom Hanks. 2-time Academy Award winner and America's most trusted man. In the spring of 1988, he was 31 years old and terrified. Big had just wrapped, and nobody in Hollywood knew yet what it was. The dailies looked good. The editors believed in it. But Tom Hanks had been in enough films that went sideways that he didn't trust good feelings anymore. He was between apartments in Los Angeles. He was between certainties about everything. He took a train from LA to Seattle in April of that year because he needed to think, and thinking required distance. The train ride was supposed to be 40 hours. He brought 3 paperback books and no real plan. Somewhere in the Oregon Rockies, 12 hours into the trip, he moved to the dining car because the air in his compartment felt too small. Eleanor Marsh was already sitting there. She was 61 years old. A retired speech and drama teacher from a public high school in Tacoma, Washington, where she had taught for 34 years. She had taken this same train every April for 7 years. Alone, because it was the only time she had to herself since her husband passed. She told Tom this in the first 15 minutes, not with sadness, but with the matter-of-fact clarity of someone who has made peace with her life exactly as it is. She had come alone because none of her friends understood why she found train journeys restorative. They thought she was strange for it. She thought they were missing something. They talked for 4 hours. She had seen every film Tom had ever made. Not because she followed celebrities, but because her students had watched Bosom Buddies in reruns, and she'd sit with them sometimes after class to talk about what made physical comedy work, what the body communicated before the words arrived. She had theories about it. Precise, beautiful theories developed over 3 decades of putting terrified teenagers on stages in front of their parents. She had come alone on this trip because none of her friends understood what she was looking for in these journeys. They called her eccentric. She called it necessary. Tom had never had a conversation like it. She talked about performance the way surgeons talk about anatomy. She said the problem with most comic actors is that they perform the emotion instead of feeling it and letting it spill. She said the great ones, Chaplin, Keaton, Bill Murray at his best, they don't act afraid. They are afraid. The camera just catches it. Tom tried to argue with her. He said performance was always performance, that there was no such thing as pure, unmediated feeling on screen, because the second you knew a lens was pointed at you, the feeling changed. She listened to the argument patiently, the way she had listened to 34 years of students who thought they had found the loophole in the lesson. Then she said, "The lens doesn't have to change the feeling if you've spent long enough believing the feeling is worth something." He didn't have a response to that. She ordered coffee. He ordered coffee. Outside the dining car windows, the mountains of southern Oregon passed in the last gray light of the afternoon. She asked him what he was most afraid of, not as a performer, as a person. He told her without thinking about it. He said he was afraid of arriving at the end of a long career and discovering that none of it had meant what he thought it meant. That the applause was just weather, not proof. Eleanor Marsh set down her coffee cup and looked at him for a moment. She said, "That's the right thing to be afraid of. That means you understand what the work is actually for." Tom Hanks, halfway through his career, sitting in a dining car somewhere in Oregon, felt something reorganize inside him. She had a small tape recorder in her bag, the Sony cassette player with the cracked hinge. She used it to record notes to herself, observations she didn't want to forget. She pressed record during their conversation without making a production of it, and at the end of the 4 hours, she rewound the tape, pressed play, and handed him the recorder so he could hear himself describe what he was afraid of. His own voice, raw and uncertain, 31 years old, afraid of being forgotten. She listened to him, listened to himself. Then she said, "That's the voice you should be making films with, not the one you use when you know you're being watched." They parted at the Seattle station. The light was flat and cold. He almost missed his stop because neither of them wanted to be the first to stand up. He asked for her address. She gave him her school, because that's where she spent most of her time anyway. He wrote to her twice that year, once in the summer after Big opened, once after the reviews came in and he understood for the first time that something in his life had permanently shifted. She wrote back both times in longhand, 3 pages each, as though letters deserved the same attention as conversations. In the second letter, she told him about a student she had at the time, a girl of 16 who had a stutter so severe she couldn't get through a sentence without stopping 3 times. Eleanor had put her in the school play anyway. She said the stutter disappeared completely the moment the girl stepped into character. Not cured, not fixed, just temporarily irrelevant, because the fear underneath it had temporarily found somewhere else to go. She wrote, "That is all acting ever is, giving the fear somewhere to go." Then the career took over, the way careers do, not by choice, not by failure of intention, just by the relentless weight of what comes next. The correspondence slowed. The years moved. Philadelphia happened. Forrest Gump happened. The statues happened. He kept her 2 letters in a box. The tape he didn't have. She'd kept. Eleanor Marsh retired in 2002. She moved to a smaller house in Tacoma near her daughter. She kept teaching private students part-time for as long as she could. She was diagnosed in February of last year with pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. 6 months, maybe less. Her daughter, in sorting through decades of accumulated life, found the cassette tape in a shoebox, written on the paper label in Eleanor's handwriting, Tom. April 1988. Train. She found the old address for Tom Hanks's production company. She wrote a letter explaining who her mother was and what was on the tape. Tom Hanks called back within 24 hours. An arrangement was made in secret. The Tonight Show was told only that a specific guest would be in the audience that evening. Staff were not given a name. They were told to leave the aisle seat in row 3 open. Behind the scenes, Tom Hanks had made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. He asked that the tape be played without warning him of the moment. He didn't want to brace for it. He didn't want to perform the reaction. He wanted to hear Eleanor's voice the way Eleanor had always told him things should be heard, completely, without armor. The producer with the cassette player walked on stage following a brief signal from Tom's handler. Tom hadn't been watching the wings. He'd been laughing at something Jimmy said. But this is the moment no one in the studio and no one watching at home ever saw coming. 300 people sat in total silence as Tom Hanks composed himself. He reached into his jacket pocket. Inside was a folded piece of paper, worn soft at the creases, the handwriting on it looping and deliberate. One of Eleanor's letters. The one from 1988. He had carried it into the studio that night without telling anyone. He unfolded it carefully. The way you unfold something that has been folded for 37 years. A woman stood up slowly from the aisle seat in the 3rd row. She was 39. Eleanor's daughter, Claire, she was holding the Sony cassette player. Tom Hanks looked at her across the distance of the studio, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. He stepped down from the desk. Jimmy Fallon, without a word, moved out of the way. Tom walked to the edge of the stage and knelt down so he was level with Claire in the aisle. She came forward. She placed the cassette player in his hands. His hands were shaking. She listened to this, Tom said. His voice barely above a whisper. Every year. She never told me. She told me, Claire said. She said it reminded her why the work matters. I was so afraid that year. She knew, Claire said. She said that was the point. Why didn't she reach out? When she got the diagnosis? Claire's hands were shaking too. Because she didn't want pity. She wanted you to remember the conversation, not the ending. Jimmy Fallon, standing to the side, put one hand over his own mouth. He did not speak. Somewhere behind him, Questlove stood up slowly from his drum kit and set his sticks down. The director did not cut to commercial. The camera operator closest to the stage did not pull back. Tom Hanks looked down at the cassette player and then back at Claire. Can I keep this? She left it for you, Claire said. She left it for you a long time ago. The standing ovation began somewhere in the middle of the audience and moved outward like a wave until every person in the building was on their feet. Tom Hanks didn't stand up to receive it. He stayed kneeling at the edge of the stage, holding the cassette player with both hands, his head bowed. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. 6 weeks later, on a Wednesday morning in early March, Eleanor Marsh passed away at her home in Tacoma, Washington, with her daughter beside her. Tom Hanks attended a small private memorial service at the high school where Eleanor had taught for 34 years. He sat in the 3rd row of the school auditorium. He did not speak from the podium. He sat with the other mourners and listened as her former students stood up one by one to describe the moment she had told them something true. The cassette player sits now in a glass case in Tom Hanks's office in Los Angeles, next to the 2 letters. His staff know not to move it. Visitors sometimes ask about it, and he tells them it's from a teacher. He doesn't elaborate. He doesn't need to. There's a kind of answer that requires no addition, like a sentence that ends at exactly the right word and trusts the listener to carry it the rest of the way. Eleanor Marsh taught drama at Lincoln High School in Tacoma from 1968 to 2002. In that time, she put hundreds of students on stages. Several went on to work in theater and film. Most didn't. Most became nurses and accountants and electricians and parents, who still, 30 years later, remember the first time she told them something they were feeling was worth an audience. Some voices stay with you longer than the lesson they were teaching.